This boat has had a tough life. It was sunk for a long period of time and sat at the bottom of a ski lake. It was dropped on a concrete floor when the lifting eyes failed and pulled up through the deck, and then it was repaired as an insurance job, which caused all of the internal framing to rot out from inside. I've just finished doing a major structural and refinish restoration on the boat to overcome all of that previous hardship. So let's take a look through some of the work that I did to get it back to its best. So when the boat first came into the shop, on initial appearances, it looked to be pretty good, but with further inspection, we saw the true extent of what happened here. So the boat was repaired as an insurance job, and the selected method of repair, unfortunately, was just to fiberglass over everything internally. That included the wooden framing and the skins of the boat. That resulted in there being a huge amount of polyester resin and chopped strand mat that was not properly bonded to the surface, as basically no attempt was made to try and properly key this up. This induced a huge amount of weight into the boat and made it perform very badly, and then of course long term proceeded to allow water ingress so that all of the framing within the boat was rotting away. So our first job was to remove all of that polyester, which luckily came out very easily due to the fact it wasn't bonded, and then cut out all of the internal timber work, which was saturated with water, so that we could replace this and make sure it's properly bonded and sealed. The next thing to do was to get the boat turned over so that we could start to inspect the hull. Now, because some of the internal framing was previously cut out of the boat before we got it, it was quite misshapen, and as you can see here, the keel is quite deformed. There's a lot of hog to the shape of the bottom, and we needed to get that straight before we then put any framing back into the boat and started to reinforce it. We need to make sure that the planing surface of this boat is nice and in the correct shape that it should be, so that the boat performs properly when it gets back onto the water. So we started out by machining a timber that we could run down the section of the keel that should be straight, and we're going to use that to then pull the keel back into its true shape. So you can see the deformation in the keel there, and you can actually see where the keel rollers are on the trailer and how they've kind of dug into the bottom of the boat. So we drilled some holes through the keel here so that we could pull this back into position. Then we installed our keel timber and used the screws from the inside to pull that back to straight, sighting down the keel to make sure that this was looking nice and fair. One side of the hull in particular was quite misshapen, so we also put this structure onto the bottom just to pull that back straight and get us within fairing tolerance that we can do when we fill and fair the bottom prior to painting it. Once the bottom was pulled back into shape, or close enough that we could correct a bit later on, we reinforced the inside of the boat. So we put 2 layers of biaxial glass on the inside, which was going to add maximum stiffness and strength to the bottom without inducing too much weight. I think we worked out that we added around about 12 to 15 additional kilograms to the boat with this, but also included a huge amount of stiffness and rigidity that would greatly increase the strength of the boat and the performance long term. We then applied a peel ply over the freshly epoxied surface so that we could remove this further on down the line, and this would give us a perfect amine blush free surface for bonding all of the new internal framework in. So the floor stringers were the first thing to go in. These little half round dowel sections that we cut out of the boat previously because they had been saturated with water and were beginning to rot. So we ripped some dowel sections in half, laid them in the bottom of the hull, and then we glassed over the top of these with individual strips of biaxial glass and epoxy resin again. So then I got on to making some of the internal timber components, and this is basically just a case of patterning the existing parts that came out and replacing them with new wood parts that we could encapsulate with epoxy. The transom doesn't have a complete frame in this boat, but it does have a bottom bow. This was originally sawn, but I decided to replace this with a laminated timber. So I cut some laminations, mixed up some West System 105-206 epoxy, and then that gets lightly thickened with some of the colloidal silica. So we've got a kind of semi-thickened mayonnaise sort of consistency epoxy here. That gets applied with a notched spreader to either face of the lamination as I put the stack together on top of a piece of polythene. Once the stack's built, that gets wrapped up into a piece of polythene, and that means I've got a nice clean part that I can handle, and then I'll put that inside the boat and use the back of the transom to form the curvature for this component. Once the epoxy has cured, that gets removed and cleaned up on the machines to give a nice finished laminated component. So the next thing to make was a couple of steering blocks that will hold the steering mechanism up forward in the boat, and a full set of frames as well. So these were partially patterned from some of the old frames that we were able to salvage from the boat, and others were just made from patterns that we had to make based on the shape of the bottom of the boat. We then made a set of stringers as well, which was scarfed together to form long enough timbers and then laminated to get a nice dimensionally stable timber, much better than the single piece solid original stringers that ran through this boat. The dry fit frames were then placed inside, and the stringers were just final fitted on those internal corners that you can see, which is where they run through the framing. Once all of this was confirmed for fitment, we could then put the gussets onto the frames and glue them up. Everything then gets epoxy coated, so it's completely encapsulated and sealed to prevent any further rot or water ingress into the wooden timber elements of the boat. Once cured, the epoxy then gets cleaned to remove the amine blush and then sanded, prepped ready to bond into the boat. This is then bonded into the bottom of the boat using thickened epoxy and then filleted along the transition between the side of the frames and the bottom to create an increased glue surface area and a nice clean bottom which is free of bug traps. The stringers can then get bonded into place, and that is the sum of all the internal structure put back into the bottom of this boat, far better than it was originally. Once the internal structure was repaired, we could then turn the boat back over and begin sorting out the exterior of the hull. So you can see that we've still got the timber on there that's keeping the keel straight. That can now come off because we've got the stringers and the frames all bonded in place. So we then began stripping off the gel coat from the exterior of the hull and fairing things to start to get a nice surface finish to the hull. Did a handful of repairs for the deeper voids and the fragile areas that were previously damaged around the gel coat, and gradually got this thing brought back to shape. When we were pretty well close with it structurally, we then covered the hull in fairing compound and did a hell of a lot of sanding, getting the hull nice and fair, ready to give a good paint finish. Then we were on to paint, so we did an Epifanes paint system on this. We used their high build epoxy primer, following on from the fairing compound, just to get those finer little details and defects sanded out within the surface and get it really nice and flat before the top coat. The epoxy primer also gives really great protection against any potential water ingress or osmosis that the GRP structure of this boat might see in the future. Once we got that nice and fair, we then went over onto top coat, and we're using the Epifanes polyurethane 2-part top coat for this boat. We did around 4 coats in total, and this was all applied by roller alone. Then it was on to painting the inside. So I use a Jotun paint product for most of the insides of my boats, and this is an epoxy top coat product which has got minimal UV protection, so it can be used in areas that are not in direct sunlight, but it's got really good resistance to oil and fuel and water, so it's a really good protection for the inside of the boat, and you can see that it looks a hell of a lot better than when we started. Next up, it was on to painting the top sides. So same process again, I used an epoxy primer here. There was a lot of filling and fairing that went on, especially to get the top sides just how I wanted them. So in the midst of that, I started work on putting the new deck on the boat. Now, whilst the original deck was in reasonable condition, we decided that because there was some damage, you can see here that we had a broken carlin down one of the sides, that it made sense to do the deck whilst we were here. So I put 2 new carlins in the boat and rebonded a lot of the deck beams and the structure to the deck to make sure that it was all nice and secure and stable and wasn't going to move around. All things that we need to consider when it comes to getting a good finish on the deck, as well as all the other elements to consider. So the 2 new carlins went in, sprung into place, and this immediately firmed up the side of the boat quite a substantial amount. The blocks that space those off the shear clamp were also renewed, and then there was a small groove routed in these because these will take the ceiling boards which will be upholstered on the inside of the boat, and they'll go in further on down the line once the upholstery is done. I then set about trying to get a new nice fair curvature to the deck, and so sprung a batten from the foredeck right over to the top of the transom so that we could get a nice fall for the new deck that was going to go into place next. Now, before the new deck planking goes on, it was a good opportunity to start to do some of the mechanical installation of the boat. So whilst we got good access with inside the boat, I decided to do this next. So the engine got dropped into place, and that allowed me to just start to do a rough alignment with the shaft and make sure that things were going to be within tolerance when it comes to doing the final alignment and the final install of the engine. This is going to affect things like the engine hatch that go over it, so this is quite a critical part of the operation. The hole for the rudder log could then get drilled as well through the new timber that was put in place there. And a little bit further down the line, that will get sealed with epoxy before the rudder log is bedded in with dolphinite. The water intake for the engine cooling also gets put through the bottom of the boat at this stage, as we covered that over when we did the reglassing and filling and fairing operation when we repaired the hull. I then did a kind of loose dry fit of all the linkages that connect up to the engine. So these are all done by mechanical linkages, both the gear and throttle, and the steering, which runs back to the tiller arm on the rudder just in front of the transom there. Then I could get on to installing the deck panels. So this is the same kind of procedure that I always follow when I'm doing decks. I'll just chuck a piece of plywood on top and roughly mark and cut these out. Plenty of oversize, plenty of trim room in there, and we'll take this down to final dimension once it's actually installed on the boat. So all the panels get cut, and then we mark out the undersides of them so that we know where it's going to be bonded. All of the joints on this deck are bonded with a stepped scarf system, and this is a system that I really like to use on decks because it gives you a increased glue surface area between every joint on the plywood, but it also gives you a nice straight line join, so when it comes to finishing the plywood, you can get a nice neat straight glue line. So I cut these stepped scarves on my scarfing jig, and I use a circular saw for that, and then they just get cleaned up with a small shoulder plane to make sure the edges are nice and straight and square. So you've got one half of the joint here which is slightly stepped, and then you've got another one which is a full scarf which has got a blunt end on it. And when the two of those mate together, you can see that you get a nice scarf joint there with lots of glue surface area and a straight line down the middle. That joint then gets wetted out with unthickened epoxy. This is a really critical stage when gluing plywood scarves like this because they're highly absorbent areas. So wetted out with unthickened epoxy and then glued with some thickened epoxy just for a small amount of gap filling within the joint. The process of doing this off the boat allows a nice even curvature to that joint as the plywood is sprung into the curvature of the deck, so you don't get a rigid line down the center. Works really nicely, and it helps just to install one large panel. You can see even the lengthways joints are glued together with a little stepped scarf joint. So you can see us installing the rear section of the deck here, and we've coated the underside of the deck already with 3 coats of unthickened epoxy to make sure it's well sealed. The plywood is then bonded in place with some thickened epoxy that covers all of the deck beams and the new carlins that we put in place. I then use this little tool to scribe the profile of the outside of the boat. So you'll notice that I've got plenty of oversized material here. This gives a little bit of room for maneuvering and kind of moving parts around, and doesn't mean that we're working to too tight a tolerance when it comes to installing the deck. That also allows us a little bit more flexibility with aligning grains within the boards. So then I'll scribe the outside of the boat and trim it down to size. I then had the job of shaping this little rear timber. So this was actually quite misshapen on the boat when it came in, and that's one of the reasons for wanting to alter the deck slightly and put a new one on. So we were able to lift this timber up and re-follow the profile of the aft deck, so it had a nice smooth roll off. But that did mean having to reshape this by hand, and lots of eyeing up work was done to get that nice and fair and even across the full width of the boat to give a really nice curvature, and I was really happy with how that came out. You can see we've got quite a difference in colour between that aft timber and the deck, so the next thing to do is to get that stained and matched in. So I'll begin by masking up the side of the boat just to avoid getting any stain or epoxy or varnish on the paintwork that is finished on the top sides. The deck then gets a final scrape just to prepare it for finishing. So this is just to try and remove any sanding marks in the surface and to kind of de-fluff some of that grain. So what I find with this particular plywood is that it ends up quite fluffy after sanding, and just giving it a scrape gets that back nice and flat for a good surface to accept a wood stain. Now, if you've watched any of my videos before, you will know that I'm a fan of spirit-based stains, or a light fast stain made by a company called Morel's, which is what I'm using here. So that gets applied by cloth, and I did a couple of different coats, and you just allow that to flash off in between and go around that with a progressively drier cloth to get a nice even streak-free finish. The finish system on this boat is an epoxy base with a 2-part clear system over the top. So I start out by applying the West System 105-207 epoxy, and with that combination you've got a hardener there that induces some UV inhibitors within the system, which makes it much better for this type of application. This is actually exactly what this product is developed for, and that also gives you a blush free surface, which is great for coating applications. So 3 coats of that get applied all in one day on top of the other. Once the first coat has tacked up slightly, that then gets sanded back and keyed up with a relatively coarse sandpaper around about 80 grit, and that surface then gets washed and degreased, ready for the next stage in the process. So next up, I'm doing the deck lines on this boat. Now, this is a process that got a surprising amount of hate when I posted these videos on Facebook, and it may not be to everybody's taste, but this is the process that the customer wanted me to use for this boat, so that's what I did. So the lines on this are actually done with a vinyl. So you can see that these are pre-spaced lines here, and these are getting laid on top of the epoxy base that is on the deck. So I install the straight lines first, gapped correctly for the original planking distance, and then the transfer gets removed. And you can see that gives us a nice, evenly, very sharply positioned set of lines. I say, not to everybody's taste by all means, but in my opinion, no less fake than the painted lines that you most commonly see on boats. If I could have done a wood inlay, I certainly would have done, but this is what we decided to go with. Once the straight lines have been laid, I can start to put in place the curved lines that form the effective covering boards on the deck. So I drew that line on there first of all. The straight lines get cut back to that, and then I laid the curved line that forms this, what would be a covering board if this was a proper laid deck. And you can see it gives us a really nice sharp finish to the deck lines. Similar process on the aft deck. I'll then trim all the overhang for the aft end, and then we put a line across, which also gives a little bit of coverage to the join between that and the rear timber. I then do one more coat of the epoxy, and that is so that it can bond these lines in place really effectively, and also begin to bury the thickness of the vinyl so that we can cover that when it comes to the varnishing process. This is again the West System 105-207 epoxy combination. So that then gets scratched back again, and then we're on to varnish. Now, if you're a follower of the channel, you will have seen many videos of varnishing, so I don't really need to go through this process again. There's a lot of sanding, degreasing, applying varnish, and then sanding, degreasing again. So it's much the same process. I'm using the Epifanes PP varnish here to get the surface nice and flat and a good volume built up. When I've finally got that into place, I get on to the final top coats. For this process, I'm using an Epifanes product called PU Speed Coat, and that is an acrylic 2-part clear, which is nice and flexible, but also has a very fast build-up time, and it's developed specifically for spray. So this allows me to build a very good volume of clear on here very quickly using multiple coats per day. So you can see that I set up a kind of makeshift spray booth within my workshop, and that filters through into the extraction booth that I have out in the back room, which is a small open-faced spray booth. So that gives me correct filtration and extraction of the overspray, which is very important. So I'm spraying this with a Devil Biss DV1 gun, which is a really nice gun that I've been recently using for finishes such as this. And there's a little look at the finish as the boat just gets wheeled outside on a slightly sunny day here in the UK, just so that I can get a bit of heat into that surface and start to bake that finish off. Also gives the opportunity for catching some really nice reflections and seeing the depth of that colour and the lines in the wood there. I was really pleased with the amount of colour that I managed to get out of that, considering we started with what was a very basic sheet of Okumi plywood. Nothing particularly fancy in the first instance, but the deck came out looking really nice. And you can see that with the contrast of those white lines there, it looks really smart. And I've got a good match, about as close as I think I was able to get with that original piece of mahogany timber across the back there, which started off as quite a difference from the Okumi decks. So next up, we're on to installing fittings. Now, all of these fittings on this boat are done in the same way, and this is the same practice that I use for all of my through hull fittings and most of the deck fittings as well. So I start by drilling an oversized hole. That might be with a hole saw or a Forstner bit, any number of different things that will fit the application. And the edges of that hole then get sealed with epoxy. So in this instance, I'm using a 5-minute epoxy just to make the process go nice and quickly. So if we've got any exposed wood within that core there, which we have here on this plate on the exhaust, that first gets sealed with epoxy. And this is a kind of double cover your back scenario. So there's also going to be another product that's actually going to seal the fitting, but this is sealing the substrate first to make sure that there's absolutely no potential for water ingress in there, even in the event that the fitting leaks. So whilst I'm waiting for that epoxy to kick, I start putting the name on the back of the boat, which is done with a adhesive vinyl. So I'm just putting the lower line of that in place with some masking tape, finding the center line to project those deck lines down to the transom so I can get it located in the middle, and then I will install the vinyl, which is a pretty easy way of doing this. To be honest, it's a bit of a cheat. I would love to hand paint this, but I am by no means a sign writer, so vinyl is the way to go. Once that's on and the epoxy's kicked, I can then install the through hole fittings. So I'm using Dolphinite here. That's the brown peanut butter product that you're seeing me apply to the fitting. So that gets put all around there, and that takes up any gap within the oversized fitting, and it also gives a complete and thorough seal around the flange as well. Now this is a really soft product. I can see that I'm smearing this all around the surface here, but this is nothing more than really a kind of thickened varnish, and it wipes away really nicely and cleanly. It sets to a soft putty consistency, and it means that when the fitting needs to be removed another day, you can just simply unbolt it and take it back out. And it's a really good system. I far prefer this to something like a Sikaflex, which actually bonds the fitting in place and will most likely require destruction of the fitting or substrate when it comes to removing it another day. Next up is the job of installing some of the deck fittings, and two of the fittings that I have to do here are lifting eyes. These aren't ever actually going to be used for lifting again. This boat is never going to be lifted on these, but they are going to be used for mooring, so they want to be fairly substantially installed, and we want to make sure that they don't create any potential for water ingress into the deck further down the line, because that is going to drastically affect the finish. This is an encapsulated epoxy finish. And just a sideline there, you can see a little plug that I've taken out from the filler cap, and you can just see that little stepped scarf joint residing under the stripe of the deck lines there. So we drill a stepped hole here. You can see we've got a larger hole on the top surface and then a smaller location hole further down. So that allows the lifting eye to be aligned, and then it also allows room for a pocket of epoxy that will sit around the outside of it and effectively cast a plug that this sits in. So the fitting is first waxed with mold release wax to make sure that the epoxy doesn't bond to it. I then mask up the area and cut a circle out for just keeping things nice and clean and to give me some space to work with without worrying about ruining the deck finish. That hole is then all wetted out with unthickened epoxy around the exposed edges of the deck. Then I mix up a thickened epoxy blend, which is a combination of the 404 high density filler, and I've just put a small amount of graphite powder in there. purely just to colour this so that I've got a nice dark finish to the epoxy so it blends in subtly with the deck. The fitting then gets buttered up with this thickened epoxy, and then the inside of that hole also gets filled out as well, with the primary focus on the larger portion where that additional space is within the fitting. The fitting then gets pushed down into place, and you can see that as I just come into the lower portion of that hole, the correctly sized hole is the one that aligns and positions the fitting. A little bit of cleanup before the epoxy kicks, remove the tapes, and then you can see the result of that fitting, nice and discreet there. It's worth me just also pointing out that these fittings are bolted from underneath with a tie rod that runs down to some structural elements within the boat. Then we're on to installing the next to the major components, so the dash can go into place and start to get fixed in, along with the windscreen that then fits on top of this GRP moulding. Handful of other fittings to do, such as the searchlight on the bow, a couple of vents, and another bow light as well, along with some rubbing strips. And that pretty much takes the boat up as far as the work that we're going to be doing on it for now. So there's a little look at the handful of fittings that we're installing on the deck as all the shiny bits start to come together. There's quite a lot of interior elements to still do with this boat. The sole boards have just got to be trimmed into place and fitted along with the seating, but most of that is almost ready to go in. There's also going to be upholstered ceiling boards that will run up the insides and will cover over the fiberglass that you can currently see there on the inside of the hull. The crash pads have also got to be upholstered and installed, and those will just cover up the edges of the deck there. But I'm really pleased with how the finish has come out, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this boat once it returns to us after having the rest of the work done. And it'd be nice to see it on the water in the sunshine in its full glory. And there's just a little glimpse, unfortunately on a rather grey English day, but you can still see a few reflections of what is to come in the deck once we get it in the sunlight. So there we go, strengthened, reinforced, refinished, redecked and brought back to far better than new condition. If you want to see more detail of the step-by-step process of this boat's restoration, then make sure you jump back and check out the full video series that I did on this one. So the boat is going to leave here now, and it's going to have all of its fit out for mechanical and electrical systems, upholstery and all the finishing touches done somewhere else, and then it will head back when we need to do the engine hatch, which just runs over the central portion of the boat here and covers off the engine, which will be the finishing touch and match the deck that I've put on the boat. So hope you've enjoyed the video, and I will catch you in the next one. Cheers guys.